One of my favorite horseshoe crab jokes is that, in coastal conservation, there's this rivalry between sea turtles and shorebirds, and
Yes.
people are usually sea turtle people or shorebird people.
Yes.
But horseshoe crabs kind of bring together those two worlds in one incredible organism. So if you like rounded creatures that spend a lot of time scooting through the water,
Yeah.
because you're a turtle person, you can find some common ground with the shorebird people when we talk about horseshoe crabs.
Yeah. Also, if you're fans of dinosaurs, horseshoe crabs are again that. So, we can find common ground everywhere. We are going to go ahead and start. And of course, we'll start with the introductions. I am Susan Inman. I am with 100 Miles. I am actually what my title is actually Mid-Coast Advocate, meaning that I work in Liberty County, McIntosh County, but of course, we don't necessarily follow borders. So sometimes I'll be in Glen, sometimes I'll be in Bryan, but for the most part, I focus on Liberty and McIntosh.
And I'm Abby Sterling. I work for Manomet, which is a nonprofit that focuses on coastal conservation using science and partnership. I've been down here on the coast for a number of years, and I've been the director of our Georgia Bight Shorebird Conservation Initiative, which has been running for about 5 years now. So we think about shorebird conservation in Georgia and South Carolina coasts, trying to address some of the big threats, and working with all of the awesome, incredible partners that are working on coastal conservation issues. So grateful to you for having me tonight, and really excited to talk to everybody about horseshoe crabs.
Yeah, this is a great conversation for 100 Miles to really be hosting, because conservation, it means something different to everybody. And it really does tie everything into place. And the horseshoe crabs are actually like Abby was saying earlier, the connective tissue with everything. It's sea turtles to shorebirds, even to humans. And that's the conversation that initiated what brought Abby and I together tonight, is because there's a proposal about bringing the synthetic alternative instead of using horseshoe crab blood for vaccines. So on that note, I will share my screen. And so Abby,
We can do mine if you want.
Yeah, you're gonna have to.
Okay.
It's not. Oh, it's because of this.
Oh.
Yeah.
No worries. It wouldn't be a Zoom talk without a little bit of technical difficulties. Let me just. Screen. Okay. Scoot out of the view here. All right. Can you all hear me all right in Zoom land?
Shoot.
You're still there. It's still running.
There we go.
Okay.
No, that was you.
Um,
There we go.
Cool. Perfect. Well, so I just wanted to start off tonight with a little bit of an overview of horseshoe crabs and shorebirds, and talk a little bit about what makes this part of the world so important for both of those species, some of the big threats, and then some of the things that we can do to really protect and promote their conservation. So I'm going to do it like this, make it look pretty. Cool. Okay, great. I think one of the coolest things about the horseshoe crab shorebird story is that this relationship between shorebirds and horseshoe crabs has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. Horseshoe crabs are an ancient creature. They're pretty much unchanged for the past 450 million years old. So there have been horseshoe crabs coming ashore every spring on our beaches for hundreds of thousands of years. And when they come ashore in the spring, they lay eggs on the high tide line. And those eggs are a very important food resource for a variety of different coastal species, including shorebirds. And those eggs are sort of a shorebird superfood that fuels migration every single spring. So as the water warms up in the spring, horseshoe crabs come ashore, lay their eggs, And then the shorebirds are moving right behind them, relying on that critical food resource. So you can see kind of a choppy video here of a feeding frenzy, shorebirds just devouring horseshoe crab eggs. I wanted to back it up a little bit farther because I wasn't exactly sure who we'll have joining us tonight, talk a little bit about what a shorebird is. When we think about shorebirds, we're talking about sandpipers and plovers, amongst other species. These little guys up in the corner, the very light colored shorebird, are sanderling. They're one of the most widespread sandpipers. So pretty much anytime you go to the beach in almost anywhere, you've got a pretty good likelihood of seeing sanderling running around on the beach like little wind-up toys. So shorebirds have long legs, long bills. They use those tools to find food, invertebrates, and worms and things like that in soft, muddy substrate. So you can see sort of the defining characteristic are long legs, long bills. They don't have webbed feet, they can't swim, and they spend most of their time sort of in this in-between zone, kind of between water and land. And I think it's really sort of one of the species that have helped us really understand what's going on with shorebird migration is, of course, the red knot. That's one of the most well-known sandpipers for their incredible journey that they take every single year. And so when we're talking about migration, we're talking about groups of animals that move from one part of their range to another. And so for many shorebirds, we see a big movement from the south to the north in the spring when they're breeding up in the Arctic tundra. And for red knots, that journey is really tremendous. Some of the red knots that we see on the Georgia coast spend the winter right now down on the very southern part of South America, down in Tierra del Fuego. And they leave in the spring, and by about mid-March, they're kind of starting to come in. By mid-April, they're definitely here. They stay for a little while here, and then they leave and they fly several thousand miles without stopping all the way up to the Arctic. So each one of these hops, they're flying without stopping, flying 4 or 5 days straight, flapping their wings the whole entire time, flying all the way up to the Arctic. And the most important thing for these birds is that they have a safe place to stop. So we have to be good hosts to our migrating shorebirds. And for these birds that are traveling tremendous distances, a good place to stop looks like a place with good food and quiet beaches where they can rest when they are refueling. We know a lot about this epic migration because of red knots that have been banded with color-coded alphanumeric leg flags. You can see in this one picture here, there's a little bit of lime green sticking off that one red knot. That's a bird that was banded in the US. One of the most famous red knots is B95, which earned the nickname Moonbird for its 14-year flight from Tierra del Fuego up to the Arctic. It traveled the distance to the moon and back. And so an annual journey for these birds is about 20,000 miles. And so over the course of the lifetime of that bird, it covered the distance to the moon and back. It's pretty incredible. Red knots are very rapidly declining species. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but these birds are actually federally protected. They're listed as a threatened species. There are a lot of specific challenges when we think about shorebird conservation. They're covering huge distances. They have really high site fidelity. So when they find a good spot, they're going to keep coming back to that spot. And so if anything changes along those places where these birds need, it could have really significant implications for the populations of these birds. And so that's one of the reasons that shorebird conservation is kind of a tricky thing. And so we are seeing some pretty significant declines in shorebird populations. You may be familiar with the paper that came out several years ago that talked about 3 billion fewer birds in our world now than there were in the 1970s. And they broke that down by different groups of birds. Out of all of the groups of birds, shorebirds were one of the ones that are declining most steeply. And so there's been a lot of different analysis over the last couple of years that have looked at some of these trends. And we're seeing, particularly for our long distance species like red knots, some really, really serious population decline. So we think we've lost about 70% of the red knots in this time period from 1980 to almost 2020. And even more alarming than those drastic numbers are the fact that we are seeing that those declines are actually speeding up or getting worse in more recent generations, which is what this figure is showing you here from some analysis with a variety of partners, including Paul Smith and Manomet scientists as well, like Stephen Brown. We're seeing here those declines from the most recent 3 generations are the dark dots, and the older declines are the lime green dots, and the farther to the left, you've got a steeper and steeper decline. So we're seeing declines are increasing. So this is really problematic, right? We've just set the stage. Shorebirds are having some pretty significant challenges. And one of the most important things that we can do when we're thinking about shorebird conservation is protecting the places that they need to feed and rest. And so that's what kind of brings us back to this horseshoe crab conservation issue. So in the spring, when horseshoe crabs are spawning, it's really important for us to be able to protect those places and actually protect the crabs that are spawning as well.
So Abby, I'm just going to interrupt real
Yeah.
quick. So we're talking about crabs mainly in Georgia, but typically they're throughout the East Coast, right?
Yeah. And so that's a great question. Horseshoe crabs are along the whole East Coast and along the Gulf Coast as well. And so, of course, being here in the Southeast, that's what we think a lot about. We'll talk a little bit about how we're learning more and more about how important horseshoe crabs in the Southeast are. So the area around Delaware Bay has been really significant for horseshoe crab spawning. That's sort of been viewed as the epicenter where they see huge numbers of horseshoe crabs spawning and really large deposition of horseshoe crab eggs on the beaches and tons of shorebirds coming in. But the Southeast is also really important for horseshoe crabs as well.
Great.
Can you make that so it's not presenter view? So I wanted to just show you a little bit about some cool horseshoe crab physiology. And don't worry. And so this is a male horseshoe crab, the underside of a male horseshoe crab. And you can see it's got, they kind of look scary, right? Like a lot of people who aren't familiar with horseshoe crabs might be a little intimidated by them at first. But they're sort of like little mini robotic vacuum cleaners. That's kind of what I think of them like. They've got a bunch of legs under here, little walking legs. This is a male. It's got a little grasping claw that looks like a little boxing glove on the front here. And that's how he grabs a hold of the female when she comes up to spawn and kind of follows her up. They've got little chelicerae, which are just like spiders have little tiny claws that help put food into their mouth. The carapace here is rounded like a horseshoe, which is where they get the name. And then the underside here are book gills. So horseshoe crabs are not true crabs. They're much more closely related to other arthropods like scorpions and spiders. But they've got these book gills. And if you were to look underneath each of these flaps are really, really thin, almost like sheets of paper. And they use that for picking up oxygen in the water. And then this long pointy tail is called the telson. And then they've got some spines on the back here. So these guys can't hurt you at all. The telson is used for steering and navigation and trying to flip them over if they get upside down, and the spines help keep them safe when things try to eat them. So super cool, super prehistoric critter that has basically not changed from the days of the dinosaurs.
And that's actually a really cool picture that you have there, because those marks in the sand are from the telson, and sometimes they'll spin themselves, in a complete 360 circle you'll see on the beach because they're trying. And so that picture shows that he's trying to flip himself back over.
And he might have been unsuccessful because it looks like his telson's a little bit wonky here. Sometimes they get damaged and you'll see them with all sorts of weird shortened tails or crooked tails. And so this guy might need a helping hand from somebody. So here you can see this is actually a photo from the Delaware area, but the female is a lot larger than the male. She can be almost a third the size, a third larger than a male. And he's kind of caught a ride, and they'll come up ashore during the high tide, during the spring. She lays eggs right in the sand and he fertilizes those eggs right behind her. So they kind of make a little divot in the soft sand and lay those eggs. And then if everything goes according to plan, retreat back into the ocean as the tide is falling, and those eggs will stay up on the sand. On average, a female horseshoe crab will lay about 80,000 eggs per year. She'll come up multiple times during a season. It takes between 2 and 4 weeks for those eggs to hatch. And survival chances are not good. 3 eggs out of 100,000 will survive the summer. So they start out, they're about the size of like a mustard grain. And then as they grow, they absorb water and they get a little bit bigger, but you see these kind of little green mustard grain looking things are the eggs. The horseshoe crabs will molt about 16 or 17 times between hatching and adulthood. The females will molt a few more times past what the males do. And it takes them about 10 years to reach maturity. Their average lifespan is about 25 years or so. So just from a biological perspective, we're talking about a creature that has a pretty low success rate for its eggs to survive, and it takes them a really long time to reach maturity. And so that's one of the big reasons that protecting horseshoe crabs when they're spawning is so important. And so they've been harvested really throughout human history. In the 1800s, they were harvested for fertilizer, and they've also been harvested for bait and for the biomedical industry as well. This photo is from Delaware, but they were used in farming fields historically during the spawning season, just collected. There's a couple different programs. One of them I highlighted just because I think it's it's been a very successful program called Return the Favor, which started out in New Jersey as a volunteer effort to flip crabs when they're stranded. So this is one very simple take-home message that you can implement this spring even. If you see horseshoe crabs flipped over on the beach, you can just pick them up by the sides of their shell. You don't want to ever pick them up by the tail because that can hurt them. Pick them up by the sides of their shell and you can place them back in the water, and that's really great. Particularly because we're seeing, more erosion in places where there is hardening of shorelines. Horseshoe crabs can get stranded and it can be really problematic for them. Excuse me.
It's that time of the year. Before you go into biomedical use, since you've kind of been talking about the East Coast in general, like how does the Georgia population compare to the other states?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. What we're seeing with populations of horseshoe crabs, the populations are monitored and reported through the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Council, ASMFC. And what we see from that organization is that populations are stable or steady, but there's some concern with on the ground observations that there's a lot of, I would say, missing information. We don't really know how horseshoe crabs are moving. We don't really know how the population is distributed. So it seems like maybe the population is all right now, but we really want to make sure that we're not having negative impacts. And so thinking about all these different harvests of horseshoe crabs can be really problematic. There's population issues in the Northeast for sure.
Right.
And a lot of modeling efforts to look at all the different factors that influence the population. And so there's restrictions on harvesting in every different coastal state along the Atlantic coast, and it varies state by state. Some have restrictions around time of year, some have restrictions about use for harvest, but it gets very nuanced and it's very quantitative, driven by statistics.
Yeah.
So what we see is that it's really tough to monitor horseshoe crabs. Some places use trawl surveys. Sometimes people are out monitoring spawning, egg counts, a lot of different techniques to try to really understand what's happening on the ground with horseshoe crabs. And I think it's something that we're all still trying to wrap our head around as a larger coastal conservation community.
Yeah, it's really interesting conversation because I was a shorebird biologist for a little while, but also worked on a barrier island, a private barrier island. And that's something that everyone would look out, whether you're doing shorebirds or sea turtles, if you're on the beach, everyone notices the horseshoe crabs. But then also, they lay their eggs, and then once they hatch, they kind of disappear a little bit, and then all of a sudden you'll see their sheds in the rack line.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, okay, well, they're here. Had no idea they were here. It's just really interesting because you're like, where'd they go? or how long do they stay here? And so that's a conversation that Abby and I were just kind of having before we started all this, is just like, well, what do you think? What do you think? Because it's all about what do we think and whether we see sheds or no sheds or adults or eggs, and that's kind of it, you know.
And that photo that I shared earlier, that had those little plastic
Mhm.
tags on those crabs, there are tagging studies to look at movement and try to get a sense of population. And there's been a lot more work that's happened in the Northeast, in part because some of the places where the crabs are spawning are a lot more accessible than they are here. So for us in the Southeast, where we're seeing horseshoe crabs spawning in more remote places that are difficult to access, it can be really tough to get a sense of what's going on the ground. And a lot of the techniques that have been used to monitor horseshoe crabs in the Northeast don't necessarily apply for us in the Southeast. Should we talk a little bit about the biomedical use of horseshoe crabs?
This is what we're here for.
So this has been one of the kind of really incredible ways that horseshoe crabs have unknowingly influenced probably every single one of our lives. Horseshoe crabs have a couple of different unique things going on. So you see the vials here of this blue liquid. That's actually the blood of the horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs have copper in their blood instead of iron like we do. So when it's exposed to oxygen, it turns blue. And they've also got, excuse me, a component in their blood, an amoebocyte that clots if there's any kind of toxin, endotoxin that it's exposed to. So through research that was conducted starting in really the 1970s was when it really first started to become more used pharmaceutically. This component of the horseshoe crab blood called limulus amoebocyte lysate was extracted and used for testing the sterility of medical equipment. And so horseshoe crabs now are harvested. I believe there's 4 or 5 facilities that harvest horseshoe crabs. They take blood and then release the horseshoe crabs back into the environment. Now, sorry about all this coughing. I'm grateful to my baby for sharing his cold with me. But basically what happens is this component is distilled from horseshoe crab blood, and literally every single thing that is used in the medical industry is influenced by that. So vaccines, medical equipment that gets implanted into your body, all of it is dependent on this LAL, it's called, to make sure that it's safe for human use. So I pulled this chart from, I think, from ASMFC, showing you all the different types of harvest. And this is happening across the whole Atlantic coast, but there is bait harvest still of horseshoe crabs, the biomedical harvest, and then the bycatch or discards of horseshoe crabs. Now, there isn't any harvest in Georgia currently, and it is, I believe, one of the very few states on the Atlantic coast that does not have any kind of horseshoe crab harvest. So that's something to note. So this is what a horseshoe crab spawning event looks like in Georgia. We're in a remote place. We've got a sandbar that will be emergent as the tide falls. We've got shorebirds that have been waiting for the tide to fall. And this, we're standing right here taking this video in water. And the shorebirds are piled up on either side of this little spot where the horseshoe crabs are gathering in these little piles, females and then males surrounding them. And as the water drops just inches, the shorebirds are flying in and trying to land. And if it's too wet still, if the tide hasn't dropped enough, they fly away and then they come back and circle over. They are that eager to get to the horseshoe crab eggs. And so what we really need to do, and we've got the opportunity to do now, is make some changes to how horseshoe crabs are harvested for this component, for this LAL. There is a synthetic alternative called recombinant factor C, and that has been used in Europe and is currently up for greater incorporation into the United States pharmaceutical industry. And so switching from that LAL to RFC is one really great way that we could move forward really as a nation to help protect horseshoe crabs. So crabs are harvested for taking their blood, but the taking of the blood actually has some pretty negative impacts. So somewhere between 15 and 30% of horseshoe crabs die from that procedure. We also know from research that even when the horseshoe crabs are returned back to the water, they might experience issues with movement, confusion, being lethargic, and they're also harvested right during their spawning activity. So basic conservation of any species is always about protecting an animal when it's reproducing, because you want to have more of them. What we see with a lot of harvest of horseshoe crabs is that it's actually targeting right during that spawning season. So it's really problematic. And so what we really need to do is have greater transparency when there is harvesting and increasing protections for spawning, and then just greater education and outreach to help people see how cool horseshoe crabs and shorebirds really are, and help them understand this link. It's not just about horseshoe crabs and shorebirds, it's also about our broader coastal ecosystem, fisheries. When there's a horseshoe crab spawning event, we see sea turtles eat horseshoe crabs, diamondback terrapins are out there, all of the fish species that everyone loves to catch. This is a huge influx of important nutrients. And so this time of year is really, really critical for our whole broader coastal ecology. And the kind of exciting thing is that we're starting to see a lot of momentum towards protecting horseshoe crabs. So more and more awareness about horseshoe crab bleeding, some of the challenges, and momentum towards moving away from that LAL and using the synthetic alternative. The other thing that we're seeing in recent years is we're having a greater understanding of how important horseshoe crabs are for shorebirds. So this is a couple of the things that shorebirds are eating when they're in the Southeast. Red knots are eating coquina clams, but then they switch when horseshoe crabs start spawning, and they eat horseshoe crab eggs because they're so easy to digest. They're like a little wonderful superfood for our shorebirds. So this video shows you, these are little horseshoe crab eggs that are about ready to hatch, wiggling around in their little eggs on a little clamshell that I'm holding. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how big they are. And we're also seeing, I mentioned a little bit about Delaware Bay being a really important place, but we're learning more and more about how important the Southeast is for shorebirds that rely on horseshoe crab spawning as well. This is research coming out of South Carolina DNR from Felicia Sanders, Adam Smith, and Larry Niles. And I'll play it one more time. So you can see each little dot is a bird carrying a satellite backpack. And we're seeing that about 2/3 of the red knots that feed here in the Southeast during the spring migration are actually going directly to the Arctic.
That's just a really cool map.
It's a super cool map.
Yep,
And
science is
for
cool.
a long time, everyone thought that all of the red knots were going up to Delaware Bay. But we now know that that is not true. 2/3 are actually getting enough food here to go all the way up to the Arctic. And so this is a threatened species that's experiencing really significant population declines. So that's just an additional line of evidence that helps us understand how important it is to protect horseshoe crabs here in the Southeast as well. And we're seeing some really incredible signs of those protections. Horseshoe crabs are harvested in South Carolina for the biomedical industry, but just recently this past spring, there was a decision to deny harvest requests out of Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, and then additionally 30 South Carolina beaches were closed down to harvest as well. And so that's sort of this larger effort that's happening across the whole East Coast, where we really are seeing more and more support for horseshoe crab conservation as it pertains to shorebird conservation as well, but just more awareness about how important these animals are for our broader food webs and the ecology of our coasts. There's actually a horseshoe crab recovery coalition, so I want to give a shout out there if anybody's interested in learning more. You can Google it, or you can look at, you can scan this QR code on your screen. and learn more about this multi-organization effort that's happening on a lot of different fronts, tackling a lot of the different issues for horseshoe crab conservation. Lots of great information on their site as well. And so I want to make sure we have lots of time for talking, and I'll wrap it up here, but I think I probably didn't cover everything. I could talk probably for hours about horseshoe crabs, so you'll just have to cut me off at some point, Susan.
Yeah, but also start putting some of your questions in the chat, if we missed anything or something like that you've always wanted to ask. That's, that's what we're here for. And so, yeah, thank you, Abby. And again, the photo that you're looking at now shows exactly how horseshoe crab is trying to right itself.
And just, I wanted to end on this slide because I think it's really interesting. So, we think about horseshoe crabs as this really important part of human health, and it can be really tricky to try to think about saying, like, we're going to try to stop harvest of biomedical use of horseshoe crabs when we're talking about human health, but they haven't been used that long in the biomedical industry. So it was really not until the 1970s that we moved away from using rabbits to test for infection in medical equipment and vaccines, and started using horseshoe crabs.
Right.
And this idea of not testing on animals, I feel like if horseshoe crabs were a little bit more cute and cuddly, we might have some
bigger eyes, a little fur.
So I shamelessly did a little Google search and found this really funny, cute horseshoe crab. But I think it's just kind of thinking through that timeline. It wasn't that long ago. In Europe, they already used the synthetic alternative.
Exactly.
There's been a lot of great research that shows that the synthetic alternative is just as effective as LAL. And so really the exciting part of tonight is saying we've got an opportunity to let this governing body called the USP know that a lot of people are excited about this alternative non-horseshoe crab derived option. And so that's, I think, one of the really cool things is we've got this chance to sort of take that step.
Yeah, it's backed by science. It's something that, let's see here. Yeah. This proposal is backed by science. It is backed by the microbiology expert committee of USP. So that is something that is we get to positively support. And so a few of the questions that we have is, if you want to, what do horseshoe crabs eat? And what eats them besides the eggs?
Horseshoe crabs are like little robot vacuum cleaners, eating all sorts of invertebrates that are kind of in the sediment of the ocean floor. So they're cruising around. They actually go pretty far offshore. If you're ever swimming in the water and you've had one like scoot by your foot or seen them swimming in an aquarium, they're able to move around really well. So they're eating a lot of little clams, crustaceans, worms, things like that.
So about how far offshore would that be? Because the next question is about, offshore wind impacts. And that might go to the part where we don't really know. And the aspect to, when our wind farms are just starting in the US. And so that's another interesting question. There's a lot of unknowns. But we do have a healthy horseshoe population compared to a few of the other areas throughout the world. So it may not have been studied in other areas.
They move tremendously far.
Yeah.
And I think it's, but there's some question about sort of like what the different population structures look like, and how maybe some of the big deltas impact movement, but they are cruising around. So it's pretty really cool.
That's really cool. See offshore. Yep. People can't see them. Yeah. Just like we were saying, Abby and I were saying, we see the eggs and then they seem to kind of disappear as they hatch out. But then you'll start finding their sheds actually on the beaches and in the rack line. And I actually have, let's see, where is it? A shed. One of the first sheds. Let's see how big it is or tiny it is. This is when you start seeing them in the rack line when they're about this big. And as you saw in the videos that Abby shared, this is quite a bit bigger. So where do they go? Where are their sheds washing up? But, and you can tell they're sheds, and they shed, because they are an arthropod. So they have the exoskeleton that they need to shed off to grow. And that's what we'll find on the beaches. I haven't found anything smaller than that, but definitely larger. But the shed itself is really fragile. So they're kind of hard to carry or to save. You know, if you've ever tried carrying a delicate seashell off the beach, doesn't always make it. So, let's see, do females tend to return to the same areas to spawn? Do you know that answer?
I am not 100% sure about their site fidelity. It's a really good question. I think that my understanding is that they have kind of a broad geography. So probably like our Georgia horseshoe crabs could be South Carolina and Georgia, but these different population structures have been studied, and I should know the answer to that, and I don't. Someone does know the answer to that. And some of these questions, I think what we can do too is copy them down, and I can look the research up and share it with you. I know I've read it. I just can't think of it off the top of my head, and so I don't want to tell you wrong.
We can always ask our cohorts and our the Horseshoe Crab Coalition. Yeah, they usually know, and
there's someone studied it, but I think they have some site faithfulness, but they're not super site faithful, because I know that when tagging studies have been done, so for instance, partners at U.S. Fish and Wildlife have done some tagging studies, they've done some tagging on Sapelo. They're not necessarily seeing those same crabs come back to the beach year after year. So there's definitely some movement in the system, but they're probably, they have, a population structure, so they'll be kind of regionally site faithful, I would say.
Right. And also back to what feeds on horseshoe crabs, the feral pig population definitely takes a big hit with because, they get up on the beaches. They're not that fast. They're fast. They're built for the water. But also if they get turned over, they're pretty much easy target. And they like them. They're tasty. It's kind of like a sea turtle egg. They're just waiting there for a predator.
And that's one of the things that actually the partners at Georgia DNR have been working on really hard, is thinking about how to control feral hogs, because they are they're eating the females that are spawning, they're eating the eggs too. So they can definitely have a huge impact on the population. Somebody else asked Sarah asked if they could be bycatch in the shrimping industry, and they can definitely be. The shrimping industry, anything where there's any kind of trawling activities going on, can definitely impact horseshoe crabs. And that's actually, if you look back in the literature of horseshoe crab protections in Georgia, thinking about the shrimpers and their interactions with horseshoe crabs was one of the things that that's influenced harvest regulations in Georgia. Yeah,
and our shrimpers typically they're just thrown back over. That's the most common and best use for the horseshoe crabs in Georgia. Now, if you're in other states, it's different, but we can speak on Georgia, where they typically just throw them back over. So this is a good deal, good thing. Last in the conversation, bycatch. All right, you guys have really great questions. I really appreciate that. And so to kind of tie all this in and why we started this was because there is a proposal that y'all can comment on, and we have a pre-written letter that is ready for you to sign. It's quite easily, you can just put your name and address in it, and it will formulate it for you. But the really wonderful thing about this letter is you can personalize it, and it looks like it's all ready to go, and it is, but also add either your experiences with horseshoe crabs or let's see here. Your experience with horseshoe crabs, what you know about horseshoe crabs, how long you've seen them, and that you want them to be around and how important they are. And you can either find it on our website at Facebook or facebook.com, or you go to 100miles.org/HS-crab. And that's where that is located.
Your screen.
Oh yeah, I can share my screen. It's doing this again.
I'm going to show you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Abby. Computers. But yeah, it's quite easy and it's ready for you to use, and Abby's going to pull it up. And again, if you have any questions beyond tonight, you can contact 100 Miles, or Manomet or you can contact Abby directly. It's asterling@manomet.org.
It is.
Okay, and then my email is Susan@100miles spelled out .org. So I appreciate you all, and please write those letters. This is a good thing, and let's push it through.
Here's, I'm just gonna show you all
Yeah, she's
the website here. So this is right at 100 Miles website. And I went to the action alerts and scrolled down, and of course, this awesome photo of horseshoe crabs comes up. We are recording this webinar, so we'll send that
Yeah.
out, and you can share it with anybody that might want some more information about just a little bit of background about horseshoe crabs and shorebirds. And then,
because we have until January 31st to get our letters in.
and so you can just click on that, and it will take you right to the page that Susan was referencing. And here's the form you can fill out.
And you can see the letter, and so feel free to write anything personal in it,
You can
and
say horseshoe crabs are the cutest. Anything that you think. would be good.
anything, yeah, anything that you want to say, we appreciate it. So again, I appreciate you joining us on a Monday night, and I hope you have a wonderful day and enjoy the conservation on the coast.